Life can change in an instant. For James and Maria, a hardworking couple raising 2 young children, that moment came when James suddenly lost his job. Just months ago, things felt stable. They had a modest but comfortable apartment, food on the table, and dreams of building a better future for their son and daughter. But now, those dreams were slipping through their fingers. Each day felt heavier than the last. Maria clipped coupons and stretched every meal, turning a simple pot of soup into 2, sometimes 3 dinners. James filled out application after application, only to receive polite rejection emails that crushed him a little more each time. The walls of their apartment seemed to close in when the landlord taped a bright red eviction notice to the front door. James stood there frozen, staring at it for what felt like forever. His stomach dropped, his hands trembled, and he whispered, "How am I going to tell Maria?" That night, when the kids were asleep, Maria sat on the edge of their worn-out couch, silently crying into her hands. She didn't want the children to see her break. She tried to be strong for them, but the weight of it all was unbearable. James sat beside her, staring blankly at the floor, ashamed and helpless. They both knew the truth. If something didn't change soon, they would lose their home. But what they didn't know was that someone nearby had been watching. And soon, everything in their lives was about to take a very unexpected turn. Because just when the family thought things couldn't possibly get worse, life delivered another blow, one that would push them right to their breaking point. The next morning, James woke up before the sun. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the eviction notice over and over in his head. He quietly got dressed, slipped on his worn-out work boots, and grabbed the folder he carried everywhere, filled with neatly printed resumes. He didn't want to wake Maria or the kids. He just whispered to himself, "Today has to be the day. It has to be." For hours, he walked across town, stopping at every shop, every office, every construction site he could find. Some managers were polite but firm. Others barely looked up before shaking their heads. Each rejection felt heavier than the last. By late afternoon, his feet ached, and his throat was dry from rehearsing the same lines. "I'm hardworking. I can start immediately. Please, just give me a chance." But every door closed in his face. Back home, Maria tried to keep things normal for the kids. She played board games with them, made peanut butter sandwiches, and pretended everything was fine. But children notice more than parents realize. When James returned, exhausted and defeated, she could see it all over his face. His shoulders slumped, his eyes empty. He forced a smile at the kids, but Maria knew the truth. That night, after the kids went to bed, their hushed voices filled the tiny living room. Maria whispered, her voice breaking, "James, what if we don't make it? What if we really lose the apartment?" James clenched his fists, ashamed. "I'm trying, Maria. I'm trying every single day. But nobody will hire me. They don't even want to hear me out." Maria's eyes filled with tears. She wanted to believe in him, but she had been quietly doing her own math. Even if James found a job tomorrow, their bills had already piled up. Utilities. Food. They were drowning. She admitted something she had been keeping from him. "James, I've been looking into shelters. If we can't pay rent by the end of the week, we might not have any other choice." The words hit him like a punch in the gut. James felt like a failure, not just as a husband but as a father. The thought of his children sleeping in a shelter, surrounded by strangers, tore him apart. He didn't know what to say. He just sat in silence, staring at the darkened window, ashamed of the reflection looking back at him. And then the worst blow came. 2 days later, the family returned home from a long walk, something they did to pass the time without spending money. But when they stepped inside, the house was eerily quiet. The familiar hum of the refrigerator was gone. The lights wouldn't turn on. The power had been cut off. The children didn't understand. "Mommy, why is it so dark?" their little daughter asked, clutching Maria's hand. James fumbled with the light switch over and over, hoping it was just a mistake. But deep down, he knew this was reality. That evening, the 4 of them sat in the living room with only the fading glow of the sunset streaming through the window. Maria tried to light a few small candles they had left from an old birthday cake. The children huddled close to her, asking questions she couldn't answer. James sat quietly in the corner, burying his face in his hands. It was their breaking point. They had no money, no job, no electricity, and soon no home. But what they didn't realize, someone was paying close attention. And the help they desperately needed was closer than they could have ever imagined. Because that very night, a neighbor who had been quietly watching from a distance was about to step into their lives, and nothing would ever be the same again. That night, the small apartment sat in silence, broken only by the flickering of tiny candles. James leaned back against the wall, his eyes fixed on the flame dancing in the darkness. Maria wrapped her arms tightly around the children, whispering reassurances she didn't quite believe herself. Across the hallway, behind a slightly cracked curtain, an elderly woman watched. Her name was Mrs. Thompson. She had lived in that building for more than 30 years. Most days, neighbors passed her by with little more than a polite nod. She was soft-spoken, private, and carried herself with quiet dignity. But she noticed things. She noticed how James used to leave every morning in his work boots, his shoulders proud, his step steady, and how lately he had been coming home empty-handed, shoulders slumped, eyes clouded with disappointment. She noticed how Maria used to greet everyone in the hallway with a warm smile, but lately her smile seemed forced, her eyes red from crying. And she especially noticed the children. She often saw them sitting on the stoop, their little legs swinging, their laughter quieter than before. That evening, when the power was cut and the family's apartment went dark, Mrs. Thompson's heart ached. Through her window, she could see the dim glow of candles. She could see the children's silhouettes huddled together. And she could see James sitting apart from them, motionless, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. For days, she had wrestled with whether to say something. She didn't want to intrude. She didn't want to embarrass them. But this was too much. She thought to herself, those children don't deserve to sit in the dark. They don't deserve to feel this kind of fear. So, she put on her cardigan, picked up a small casserole she had baked earlier that day, and gathered a few extra candles from her kitchen drawer. She stood in her doorway for a moment, hesitating, her hand trembling slightly as it reached for the doorknob. She whispered, "Lord, give me the right words." When she finally knocked, the sound startled the family. James exchanged a quick glance with Maria. He wasn't expecting anyone. Carefully, Maria opened the door, her face illuminated by the faint candlelight. There stood Mrs. Thompson, her gentle eyes filled with kindness. "I thought you could use a little light," she said softly, holding out the candles and the casserole. "And maybe some comfort too." Maria's eyes welled up instantly. She tried to speak, but the lump in her throat was too heavy. She simply nodded, stepping aside to let the neighbor in. The children's faces lit up at the sight of warm food. They hadn't eaten much that day. Mrs. Thompson set the casserole on the table, its rich aroma filling the room, and the kids rushed over eagerly. For the first time in weeks, the apartment didn't feel as heavy. There was warmth, not just from the food, but from the presence of someone who cared. Maria whispered, "Thank you, we didn't know what we were going to do tonight." Mrs. Thompson smiled gently, her voice calm and reassuring. Sometimes, the smallest bit of light can push back the darkness. You don't have to carry this alone. James, humbled and quiet, lowered his gaze. He had been holding so much shame inside, a shame that he couldn't provide. Yet here was a woman who wasn't judging him, just offering kindness. As the night went on, they shared tea in chipped mugs, sitting around the table. At first, the conversation was light, but eventually, Maria couldn't hold it in anymore. The burden she had been carrying spilled out, and for the first time, someone truly listened. Because what Mrs. Thompson said next would shock them, and change the direction of their lives forever. As the candles flickered on the table, Maria sat with her hands wrapped tightly around her warm cup of tea. Her voice trembled as she finally allowed herself to say out loud what she had been keeping inside. She told Mrs. Thompson everything. How James had lost his job. How the bills kept piling up, faster than they could pay. How they had fallen behind on rent and received an eviction notice. How their electricity had been cut off that very day. And worst of all, how they had begun talking about shelters, because soon they might not have anywhere else to go. The words poured out like a dam breaking. Maria cried as she spoke, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. James sat silently beside her, his face tight with shame, barely able to meet Mrs. Thompson's eyes. He hated admitting that he couldn't provide for his family. But Mrs. Thompson didn't judge them. She didn't scold them. She didn't look down on them. She simply listened, patiently, kindly, with compassion in her eyes. When Maria finished, the room was quiet. Even the children, sensing the heaviness, sat still, watching the grown-ups. Mrs. Thompson finally reached across the table, placing her wrinkled hand gently over Maria's. Her voice was soft but steady. "Sweetheart, you're not alone. You hear me? You're not alone in this." Maria broke down again, this time not from despair, but from the rare relief of finally feeling heard. Then, after a moment of silence, Mrs. Thompson said something that stunned them both. "I'm going to cover this month's rent for you." The words hung in the air. Maria's eyes widened. James immediately shook his head. No, Mrs. Thompson, we couldn't let you do that. We can't accept something like that." But Mrs. Thompson smiled knowingly. "It's not charity, James. It's kindness. I know what it feels like to struggle. Years ago, when my husband passed away, I nearly lost everything too. Someone stepped in for me. And if they hadn't, I don't know where I'd be today. Sometimes we're given help so that one day we can give it to someone else." James felt his throat tighten. He wanted to argue, to refuse, but deep down he knew his children needed this. His family needed this. He blinked back tears, nodding slowly, his voice breaking as he whispered, "Thank you. I don't even know what to say." But Mrs. Thompson wasn't finished. "I want to do more than just pay your rent," she said gently. "My nephew owns a small construction company not too far from here. He's always looking for good, hard-working men. I think you'd be a great fit. If you're willing, I can give him a call tomorrow." James froze. His mind raced. Was this real? Was this actually happening? After weeks of nothing but closed doors and rejection, here was a lifeline, an opportunity. He felt both relief and fear at once. What if he wasn't good enough? What if he failed again? Maria reached over, squeezing his hand. "James, take the chance," she whispered. "Please. For us." James swallowed hard, his pride and his hope battling inside him. He looked at Mrs. Thompson, her eyes filled with genuine care, and finally nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll do it." For the first time in weeks, a small spark of hope returned to the room. The darkness didn't feel quite as heavy anymore. But James had no idea just how much this one opportunity would change everything. Because the very next day, when James walked into that construction office, his life would be put to the test, and what happened next would determine the future of his entire family. The following morning, James stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the collar of his only decent shirt. It was slightly faded, the fabric worn thin, but he smoothed it carefully, wanting to make the best impression he could. His children watched quietly from the couch, sensing how important this day was. Maria walked over, resting her hands gently on his shoulders. "You've got this," she said softly, her eyes filled with encouragement. "Just be yourself. Show them the man I know you are." James nodded, though inside, his stomach churned with nerves. He had faced countless rejections over the past weeks. Each one had chipped away at his confidence, making him feel smaller and smaller. But today was different. This wasn't just another cold application or impersonal interview. This was a chance that came from kindness. A chance given to him by someone who believed in him. Mrs. Thompson met him in the lobby of the building and offered a reassuring smile. "My nephew's expecting you," she said warmly. "I told him what kind of man you are. The rest is up to you." As James entered the small construction office, he could smell the faint mix of sawdust and fresh paint. Men in work boots walked in and out, their voices carrying from the back where tools clanged against steel. Behind a wooden desk sat a sturdy man in his 40s, Mrs. Thompson's nephew, Mr. Daniels. He looked up from a stack of papers and gave James a firm nod. "You must be James," he said, standing to shake his hand. His grip was strong, confident. "My aunt speaks very highly of you. Please, have a seat." James sat down, his palms sweaty, his heart pounding in his chest. Mr. Daniels began with the usual questions. Tell me about your experience. What kind of work have you done before? What are your skills? James spoke honestly. He explained how he had worked construction jobs in the past, how he was strong, dependable, and willing to learn anything. He admitted he had been out of work for a while, but emphasized how much he needed this chance, not just for himself, but for his family. His voice trembled at times, but there was a raw honesty in his words that even he couldn't disguise. Mr. Daniels listened carefully, nodding. He could see the determination in James's eyes. But more than that, he could see the desperation of a man who wasn't looking for a handout. He was looking for a way forward. Finally, Mr. Daniels leaned back in his chair, studying him for a moment. You know, he said slowly, I can teach someone how to use a tool. I can train someone to read blueprints. But I can't teach work ethic. And I can't teach heart. That's something a man either has or he doesn't. James held his breath. A small smile spread across Mr. Daniels's face. I think you've got both. I'll give you a shot. You start Monday. For a moment, James couldn't move. He blinked, stunned, as the words sank in. He had a job. After weeks of rejection, humiliation, and hopelessness, he finally had a way forward. His voice cracked as he said, "Thank you, you won't regret this." When he walked out of that office, the air felt different. The sun seemed brighter, the street noisier, the world more alive. For the first time in a long time, James felt hope. He hurried home, his steps quicker, his heart lighter. When Maria opened the door and saw the look on his face, she didn't need him to say a word. Tears filled her eyes as she asked, "James, did you get it?" He nodded, unable to hold back his smile. The kids jumped up and down, hugging their father, their laughter echoing through the apartment. For the first time in weeks, the darkness in their home lifted. But James knew this was just the beginning. There was still a long road ahead. Rent to catch up on, bills to pay, food to put on the table. But now, they had something they hadn't had in a long time, a fighting chance. Because when James brought home that very first paycheck, what he decided to do with it would leave everyone, including Mrs. Thompson, completely speechless. The following weeks were some of the hardest, and yet most rewarding days James had lived through in years. Every morning, before the sun even rose, he laced up his old boots and headed out to the construction site. The work was grueling, lifting heavy beams, hauling cement bags, standing for hours in the hot sun, or braving the chill of early mornings. His muscles ached, his back burned, and by the end of each day, he was completely exhausted. But James didn't complain. Not once. Because for the first time in a long time, he had purpose. He had dignity. Each drop of sweat felt like proof that he was climbing his way back, step by step. At night, when he came home covered in dust and dirt, Maria would hand him a glass of water, and the kids would race to hug him. Their smiles gave him more strength than any paycheck ever could. Then came Friday. Payday. James stood in line with the other workers, his heart pounding as the foreman handed him a small envelope. He held it carefully in his hands, almost afraid to open it. This wasn't just money, it was hope, security, survival. When he got home, Maria met him at the door. "So, how did it go?" she asked nervously. James smiled, pulling the envelope from his pocket, and together they opened it at the kitchen table. The kids leaned over curiously as James unfolded the check. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Maria gasped softly, her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. Enough to pay for food. Enough to keep the lights on. Enough to take the first step toward stability. James looked at the children, who were already dreaming out loud about pizza for dinner and maybe even ice cream for dessert. He smiled. But deep down, he knew exactly what he needed to do first. The next morning, James knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door. She opened it slowly, surprised to see him standing there, his face serious but his eyes determined. He held out a folded envelope. "Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, "this is for you. It's my first paycheck. I want you to take it." Her brow furrowed. "James, no. That money is for your family. You need it more than I do." But James shook his head firmly. I made a promise to myself. The first thing I'd do when I finally earned again was repay the kindness you showed us. You saved my family from losing everything. I'll never forget that. Please, let me do this." Mrs. Thompson's eyes softened as she looked at him. She hesitated, then slowly accepted the envelope, though her hands trembled as she did. She pressed it against her chest, her voice breaking. "James, you don't know how much this means. Not the money, but the fact that you honored your word. You're a good man. And your children, they're lucky to have you." Maria appeared at the doorway, smiling through tears. The children, too young to fully understand, clung to James's legs, proud of their father. With each passing week, things began to shift. The lights came back on. The refrigerator, once nearly empty, now had milk, bread, and fresh fruit inside. Bills were still tight, but manageable. Slowly, the dark cloud that had hung over the family started to lift. Laughter returned to their home, echoing through the small apartment. And through it all, James never forgot the moment that turned everything around, the night Mrs. Thompson knocked on their door with candles and a casserole. But James knew there was still one more thing to do. He and Maria wanted to thank Mrs. Thompson in a way she would never forget, and what happened that evening would leave the entire room in tears. Weeks turned into months, and life inside that small apartment slowly transformed. The bills were being paid, the fridge stayed stocked, and for the first time in a long while, the family could breathe without fear hanging over them. James worked hard every single day, but each night he came home to a house filled with laughter instead of silence, warmth instead of worry. But through it all, there was one thought James and Maria couldn't shake. They owed everything to Mrs. Thompson. Without her stepping in, without her courage to knock on their door that night, they might have lost their home. Their children might have been forced into a shelter. Their family might have broken under the weight of despair. So one evening Maria suggested, "James, I think it's time we properly thank her. She deserves more than words." James nodded, already knowing exactly what she meant. Together, they planned a simple but heartfelt dinner. Maria cooked all afternoon, carefully preparing Mrs. Thompson's favorite dishes she had learned about during their late-night talks. The children drew colorful cards with crayons, writing messages in shaky handwriting. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson, for saving our family." When the table was finally set, candles glowing, plates neatly arranged, James took a deep breath and walked across the hallway. He knocked on Mrs. Thompson's door. When she opened it, James smiled warmly. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, "we'd be honored if you'd join us for dinner tonight." She looked surprised, her eyes glistening. "Dinner? Oh, James, you didn't have to," but James shook his head gently. "Please, we want to." A few minutes later, Mrs. Thompson sat at their table, surrounded by the family she had once rescued with nothing more than a casserole, a few candles, and a kind heart. The children chattered excitedly, showing her their drawings. Maria brought out the dishes, the rich aroma filling the air. And for the first time in a long while, there was no heaviness, only joy. Halfway through the meal, James stood, raising his glass of water. His voice trembled as he looked at the woman who had become so much more than a neighbor. "We were close to losing everything," he said, pausing as emotion caught in his throat. "There were nights I didn't know how to face my wife or how to tell my children the truth. But you reminded us that we weren't alone. That kindness still exists. You gave us hope when we had none. And because of you, my family has a future again." Tears streamed down Maria's cheeks. Mrs. Thompson covered her mouth, trying to hold back her emotions. Even the children grew quiet, their eyes wide as they listened. James lowered his glass, his voice softer now. "You didn't just save us from losing our home. You saved us from losing our faith. In people, in ourselves. We will never forget that." The room was filled with quiet sobs, then laughter, then the comforting sound of clinking glasses as they all toasted together. That night, in that modest apartment, there was no landlord, no eviction notice, no overdue bills. There was only gratitude, love, and the powerful reminder that one act of kindness could ripple through an entire family's life. As the evening wound down, Mrs. Thompson held one of the children's crayon cards in her hands, smiling through her tears. "You know," she said softly, I thought I was just helping my neighbors. But you've given me something too. You've reminded me why we're here, for each other. And with that, the story came full circle. Moral of the story: even the smallest act of kindness can create a ripple that changes lives forever. When we choose compassion over indifference, we don't just help someone through their darkest moment. We remind them that they are not alone. And sometimes, that reminder is all it takes to save a family. And this story is a reminder: kindness costs nothing, but it can mean everything. If this touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us what truly matters. And remember, we're not just telling stories. We're changing lives.